Good Day Culture Symposium. I'm pleased to introduce you to this language, history, and culture panel I had initially dubbed Kriol Poetics. This interest in the early poetry of Belize has led me to the pages of old newspapers from the late 1800s to the early 20th century in British Honduras that are housed in the National Archives. These archive periodicals have attracted international, multidisciplinary, and multi institutional energy here with this project. Exploring the archive of Belizean newspaper poetry, our research team consists of a couple professors, an adjunct lecturer, and graduate and undergraduate research assistants. We're based in four different universities and have been working at creating an archive of newspaper poetry. Our presentations in this panel all use or engage the archival materials in different ways, and the effect is to reveal a fascinating interplay between language, history, and culture. We hope to show how archives exist not only to access the historical record, but also how they can become active sites of meaning making. For enabling this exploration into the early newspaper poetry of Belize, I need to first thank some individuals and institutions, including, of course, Culture Symposium, for this opportunity to continue an interest we started several years ago. My colleagues at the University of Belize, serendipitous conversations I've had with scholars like Bennett Therington of the Australian Association for Caribbean Studies, who've asked thought provoking questions about Creole language and poetic form, prompted these presentations. The fact that this has become a collaborative archival research project is only due to support I received from an internal research grant out of the research office at the University of Belize that enabled the hiring of research assistants within the English program. Thanks also to Professor Nick Fuller Medina, with whom I am teaming up here and who offered further support through the Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility and the Linguistics Department at Swarthmore College in the US, and for the research assistants out of Swarthmore and Bryn Mawr College, assisting with bibliographic compilation and digital scholarship out of the US. Support for this project also comes from the staff at Belize Archives and Records Service and the National Heritage Library, both of which granted special access to their newspaper archives. All these networks and support enabling myself and students to scour newspaper scans and microfiche as a literary and cultural repository. What is this research about? The research project involves the identification and collection of poems, letters, songs, any relevant literary resources that we found in the newspapers of Belize composed by local writers during the early 20th century and late 19th centuries. It involved the use of optical character recognition software to extract text from scanned newspaper formats. And we, as researchers, began compiling an exhaustive historical bibliography, performing textual analysis and contextualization of the collected works. This presentation offers then a little snapshot of research that is very much in progress. So among our immediate objectives here in exploring the role of early 20th century newspaper poetry in British Honduras and assessing ways it might have both reflected and shaped or tried to shape Belizean culture and identity under colonial rule is to first create a bibliography. And this would be a comprehensive bibliography, one of the major outputs of the initial part of our research project. A bibliography of these early literary contributions recorded in the newspapers. This helps to assess the size and scope of the resources extant. One problem we encountered is the challenge to our attempt at comprehensivity in the fact of a discontinuous archive. While the archives in Belize are extensive, we were confronted with gaps in the record. One might be enticed by references in one newspaper to poems that were published in another, only to be frustrated when that reference paper no longer existed, or for which that particular issue remained missing from the archives. Tracking down these newspaper ranges that are unavailable in Belize remains a task requiring widened scope. Initial searches in the British Library catalogue reveal similar gaps. If there are private collections of Belize's early newspapers out there, we do not know. To our knowledge, a comprehensive bibliography of these literary sources has never before been attempted, and thus one of the practical contributions the project makes is to develop this bibliography that might encourage further work on the archive. Hopefully, the significance of this bibliography is self-evident for most of you, but the particular significance might differ according to discipline and interest. And so in this panel, we explore some of these particular interests that the archive provokes. So far, I can now report we have over 1,000 poems in our database. I have to credit the industry and assiduity of the research assistants I have here in compiling this list. They have their own stories, as you will hear, involving their personal interaction with this archive, having become denizens of the archives themselves throughout this process, peering into the past. Our task is to organize them by metadata tags established by such institutions as the Digital Library of the Caribbean in such a way that they can be more universally useful. After completing this initial bibliography, our next steps will involve engaging the archive through different methodological lenses, as suggested in this panel. As you can see here, this is a smaller sample of the poems that we migrated from spreadsheet to a cloud-based bibliographic software. And this will help us eventually to publish the bibliography. The vast majority of the poems found are in English, and this is understandable given the context and the language of the papers. But several are written in Spanish. I have here an example by Hector Lara, a poem titled Motivo Invernal, the first couplet of which reads, Cae la lluvia incesante con monótono chis chis. Some of them are written in Kriol. Here is J.S. Martinez with a poem in his own Creole vernacular called Hard Times. The refrain from the poem you can make out there in the text. Time is getting harder every day. What is happening to a country now? There's also some paratext like the advertisements and classifieds and images that contain a few examples of Spanish and even dialect poetry. There are notable figures in the archive, including Samuel Haynes and Philip Goldson. There are recurring figures like C. Jacinto Radford, who have whole series devoted to them. And James Sullivan Martinez functions in the pages of the Belize Independent as a kind of poet laureate. Here's an example that I've included here from Philip Goldson circa 1939 titled To the British Honduras Forestry Unit. And if you check out the initial line, it says, Men go forth and do your stuff. That the empire needs you is enough. Go tell them you are Honduranians all who have answered to the empire's call. And it sounds like some kind of encomium to British Honduras industry. This is probably commissioned a work of patriotism for the colony as part of the empire. And what is interesting here is the subject position implied in the poem. The persona, clearly a subject of empire, nonetheless expressing feeling of patriotism for this local spot and people. But the historical limits of the archive of poetry in the newspapers here is belied by an oral tradition of poetry born from song that parallels the written poetry in this archive and stretches back to even earlier lyric antecedents, as exemplified in Irvin Beck's scholarship here, which he transcribes some Creole folk songs when he terms answer songs. What the archive does suggest, however, is that the poetry being circulated and disseminated in newspapers in Belize moved from being simply imported Victorian poetry of Kipling, Tennyson, and Byron that might be included to cash in on colonial cultural capital, that is, aping what is celebrated in Britain, to original poetry and Even African American poems and writings from publications in Atlanta, for example, and elsewhere circulating the Black Atlantic. Belize newspapers included sections of their papers called Gems in Verse, featuring local and international poets, and Our Local Poets column, expressing national cultural opinion and sentiment. In Creole Noise, Belinda Edmondson describes the circulation and dissemination of African American poems and comic dialogues as an explosion of poetry and performance that proliferated in the Caribbean as blacks emerged from slavery to claim land, advocate for education, and press for political power. Perhaps it seems obvious, but I see in our archive support for Edmondson's suggestion of the correlation between burgeoning national self awareness and political maturity, creative poetic output published in our papers. Additional factors for the proliferation include the slowly expanding literacy in British Honduras, despite colonial legacies of underdevelopment, imported periodicals and books that were sometimes advertised in the papers. But I am specifically interested in the Creole poetry that appears here because I find the context surrounding the appreciation of Creole and dialect literature particularly fascinating. Poetry in the papers is situated alongside opinion articles clamoring for freedom from the scourge of the colonial government, calling for land reform and constitutional reform. The legacies of colonial underdevelopment, violence, and economic constraint further provided impetus for purposeful creation. While agents of imperial power may have viewed dialect as if it were a poor imitation of a European, African, or Asian original, the fact of its birth in the Caribbean reveals a cultural newness and originality that nationalists seize upon then and now to press for authenticity and to use as shibboleths of belonging. The voices, narratives, personalities, and poems that emerge from the microfiched pages of the late 19th and early 20th century newspapers held in the Belize Archives and the National Heritage Library reveal a burgeoning appreciation of Creole literature. This is the paradox of Kriol, Belinda Edmondson discusses in her book Creole Noise, a liability and asset, despised and desired, but essential to the nationalist project because it becomes a tool for resistance and advancement. In this way, language itself highlights the complex and contradictory ways Caribbean cultures have navigated the historical and contemporary pressures of colonialism, nationalism, and cultural identity. As emergent indigenous linguistic and literary styles parallel the search for political and economic autonomy, a difficult social positioning is enacted by those who create these literary performances. And the hypothesis that I will seek to defend in the research is, simply put, that the creative works published in the pages of early Belize newspapers constitute a collective national utterance. Peering into this archive, one witnesses identity in motion. The poems perform and thereby reify Belizean subjectivity.